Let's take a closer look at the functions of skeletal muscle. Skeletal muscles are muscles that are attached to the skeleton. So they're attached to the bones in the body. They might also be attached to the deeper layers of the skin. Um, and so lots of different functions are associated with our skeletal muscles. So the main one is that they contract in order to produce body movements. So our muscles are attached to our bones by tendons, and when the muscles contract, they pull on our bones. And the movement or the pulling on those bones allows us to do things like wave our hand, kick our leg out, or walk around in our environment. Some of your muscles also prevent movements from happening. So for example, while you're sitting up straight, the muscles in your back are contracting in order to keep you sitting up straight. If those muscles didn't work, then you would slump over. Muscles also help to stabilize some of your joints, such as the muscles around the knee and the elbow and the shoulders and the hips. Some skeletal muscles can control the movement of substances in and out of internal tracts. So some examples are the external anal sphincter. The external anal sphincter is it's kind of a circular band of skeletal muscle that allows you to basically voluntarily decide when you're ready to release feces from the large intestine. So basically when you poop, you can voluntarily open up that external anal sphincter in order to allow yourself to poop in a proper location. Same thing with the external urethral sphincter. This is also a circular band of skeletal muscle that allows you to hold your urine in your urinary bladder until you're ready to release it in an appropriate place like a toilet or a bush or wherever you happen to be releasing your urine. Your skeletal muscles also help to protect your internal organs. So, for example, your abdominal cavity doesn't really have much bony protection, but you do have a lot of abdominal muscles there, and those abdominal muscles can take some of the impact associated with the hit. So it can help protect your stomach and your intestines and your spleen and your liver and your other abdominal organs. Your skeletal muscles can also contract involuntarily, which is what we call shivering, and that helps to generate heat for thermoregulation. So when you get cold, your skeletal muscles start to shiver, and that shivering produces heat as a byproduct, which helps to keep you warm, to keep you from freezing to death. Now, a skeletal muscle is kind of organized in different structures. So we can start by looking at an entire skeletal muscle, and then we can break it down into smaller and smaller segments. So for example, an entire muscle, we can say maybe the biceps muscle in your upper arm, is made up of fascicles. And so a fascicle is just a bundle of skeletal muscle fibers. So the fascicles are made up of several skeletal muscle fibers, and since skeletal muscle fibers are kind of long and cylindrical, they're actually, or I'm sorry, the skeletal muscle cells are like long cylinders, so we call them fibers, but these two terms are used interchangeably. So a skeletal muscle fiber is the same thing as saying a skeletal muscle cell. Now within a skeletal muscle cell or fiber, we have these structures called myofibrils. And these myofibrils contain myofilaments that are organized in these structures called sarcomeres. So we'll take a closer look at these different structures as we look at the structure of the skeletal muscle cells a little bit more in depth. So first, let's take a look at the entire muscle and then fascicles and skeletal muscles to see how they are kind of connected but also separated from each other. So a skeletal muscle has these, we call them sheaths of connective tissue. So a sheath is just kind of like a covering or a coating of connective tissue. And altogether they're called Mysia, but there are 3 different levels of Mysia. So if we look at, this is an entire muscle fiber, or I'm sorry, an entire skeletal muscle here, And then this area here, we have some fascicles in here. And then within the fascicles, we have individual muscle fibers. So this is looking at the whole muscle, and then we're looking at smaller and smaller structures associated with that muscle. So each individual muscle cell here is surrounded by its own covering or coating, of Mysia called the endomysia or an endomysium. Now, a whole bunch of these muscle fibers bundled together, and you can kind of see here, this little bundle is called a fascicle. And so this fascicle that's been pulled out here, each one of these little circles is a different muscle fiber or a different muscle cell. So each muscle cell is surrounded by endomysium, and then this entire fascicle or group of skeletal muscle cells is surrounded by paramysium. And then the paramysium, the fascicles are also kind of lumped together, and the entire muscle is surrounded by epimysium, which is the outermost connective tissue sheath. Now, these connective tissue sheaths provide a lot of different functions for the skeletal muscle itself. So it provides a space for blood vessels and nerves, because every single every single muscle cell needs to have access to a nerve in order to be stimulated, and it needs access to blood vessels so that it can get the nutrients it needs to make ATP, which is the energy molecule that the cells use in order to produce the contractions. So that connective tissue gives a space for those blood vessels and nerves to get to every single skeletal muscle cell. It also helps to separate the muscles from other organs. So this outermost layer, the epimysium here, is a kind of a division between the muscle and maybe the bone that it's up against, or between the muscle and the skin. So it kind of helps to anchor things in place, but then also create a little bit of a separation between the different structures in the body. These mysia, these connective tissue sheaths, also extend past the end of the muscle to form a tendon. And that connective tissue will fuse with the periosteum of a bone, and that's how the muscle is attached to the bone. So it's a very, very tight connection, a very, very strong connection, because you have the connective tissue from the bone fusing together with the connective tissue of the muscle. And one thing I wanted to point out, I'm going to go back a slide, but these fascicles here, these fascicles are just groups of muscle cells, as I mentioned before. So if you've ever had pulled pork or pulled chicken or any sort of meat where you cook it and then you kind of shred it and pull it apart, the natural areas where that meat pulls apart is at the paramysia. And so what you're pulling apart are the fascicles of the meat, and that's what's giving you that kind of shredded pork or shredded chicken type appearance. So the cooking helps to break down the connective tissue, and then you can pull the meat apart at the paramysia in order to end up with the little pieces of a fascicle, or the little pieces of meat.